It was a quiet Tuesday night, and I had the same routine I always did. Books spread across my desk, a cup of instant coffee cooling by my side, and the faint hum of my old radio keeping me company. As a student trying to make sense of late-night study sessions, the radio was my lifeline. There was something comforting about the static between channels, as though it bridged the gap between my restless thoughts and the silence of the world outside. I wasn't looking for anything specific when I stumbled across it. I'd been turning the dial absent-mindedly, searching for some ambient background noise to break the monotony. That's when I heard it. A faint, crackling voice, buried beneath layers of static. At first, I thought it was just interference from some distant station. The voice wasn't speaking words I could understand. It sounded like fragmented phrases, disjointed and unclear. Intrigued, I leaned closer, adjusting the dial with precision, trying to sharpen the signal. Awake, beneath, watching, the words were distorted, like they'd traveled through decades to reach me. I furrowed my brow, glancing at the radio's frequency display. It was tuned to 103.3, a station I didn't recognize. This wasn't one of the local broadcasts I knew. Curiosity got the better of me, and I stayed on the station for a while, listening as the voice continued its peculiar monologue. It didn't feel like a standard radio show or even a prank. There was something deliberate in the cadence, almost hypnotic, as if the speaker was trying to deliver a message just for me. By midnight, I'd stopped studying altogether, fixated on deciphering the fragments. I even grabbed a notebook to jot down the snippets I could make out, though they didn't form any coherent pattern. Open the door, forgotten. It's too late. My chest tightened slightly, but I brushed it off. It was late and I was likely reading too much into it. Still, as I flipped through the channels later, I found myself circling back to 103.3. Each time, the voice was there, waiting, whispering cryptic phrases. I decided to Google the frequency, wondering if anyone else had written about it. But all I found were forums filled with vague mentions of a pirate station that only broadcasted during the early hours. A few posts hinted at strange experiences, but nothing concrete. As the night wore on, I resolved to investigate further. Maybe it was a college prank or an experimental project. But deep down, something didn't sit right. The voice, even through static, had a peculiar way of embedding itself in my thoughts. When I finally turned off the radio and crawled into bed, my mind wouldn't let go of the fragments I'd heard. The next night, I found myself drawn back to the radio like a moth to a flame. I had told myself I wouldn't, that the distraction had already cost me enough study time. But as I stared at my desk piled high with books, the silence felt oppressive. The memory of that fragmented voice called to me, a peculiar itch in the back of my mind I couldn't scratch. I turned the dial with more purpose this time, skipping past the usual stations until I landed on 103.3. Static buzzed faintly, and then, as if waiting for me, the voice emerged again. November, Sycamore Street. No escape. I froze, my pen poised midair over my notebook. Sycamore Street wasn't some random location. It was a block away from campus, a road I walked nearly every day. My fingers tightened around the pen as I began scribbling notes. Can't outrun it. 1974. Mark. The voice didn't shout, didn't emphasize. It simply existed, smooth and calm, as if delivering the news of the day. But the words clawed at me, leaving a cold knot in my stomach. Determined to make sense of it, I spent hours combing through the phrases. They didn't form coherent sentences, but there was a pattern if I squinted hard enough. Dates, locations, names. They stood out from the otherwise jumbled murmurs, like loose threads waiting to be pulled. I was about to write it all off as coincidence when I thought of something. On a whim, I opened my laptop and searched Mark 1974 Sycamore Street. The results hit me like a punch to the gut. The top link was a decades-old article about a missing college student named Mark Lively. He'd vanished one night after telling friends about hearing a strange signal on his radio. His last known location? Sycamore Street. The hair on my arms prickled. Could have been a fluke. Sure, but it didn't feel like one. My pulse quickened as I dove deeper into online forums, reading posts from people claiming to have heard the same station. Each story followed a similar thread. Names, dates, locations whispered into the static, like a puzzle waiting to be pieced together. And the endings were all eerily the same: silence. Some of the posts were old, years even, and those users hadn't logged in again. Others were newer but vague, their authors disappearing from the forums entirely after detailing their encounters with 103.3. I couldn't stop myself. I began charting the information on a sheet of paper, connecting the dots between the fragmented broadcasts and the disappearances. There was no denying it. The station wasn't just a curiosity. It was a warning, or perhaps something far darker. The more I uncovered, the heavier the air around me seemed to grow. My dorm room, once cozy, now felt stifling, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. The sound of the voice, even when the radio was off, seemed to echo faintly in the back of my mind. Why me? Why now? The logical part of my brain screamed for me to stop, to leave it alone and get back to my life. But something else, something deeper, urged me forward. The voice, the station, the messages, they were speaking to me, weren't they? That night, sleep didn't come easily. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flashes of the names, the dates, the places, and somehow I knew I wasn't just a listener anymore. I was a part of whatever this was. I swore I wouldn't listen again. After the endless spiraling of my thoughts last night, I shoved the radio under my bed, thinking that out of sight would mean out of mind. But as the hours stretched into the dead of night, I realized I was lying to myself. The voice wasn't just on the radio anymore. The static seemed to linger in my ears like a phantom sound, and with it, that soft, deliberate cadence whispering words I shouldn't know. I couldn't focus on anything. My coursework, the noise of the city outside my window, even my own thoughts. Eventually, I gave in. Pulling the radio from its hiding spot, I set it on my desk with trembling hands and turned the dial. Static. Then the voice, low and unwavering. June 16, Blue Bicycle. She cried so hard, my throat tightened. That date, it was my sister's birthday, and the voice was recounting an incident I hadn't thought about in years. When we were kids, I borrowed her bike without asking, crashing it into a fence and breaking the handlebars. She had sobbed for hours. No one knew about that, not even my parents. North Hallway math quiz. You lied. The words hit me like a punch. The North Hallway was where I had hidden after skipping a quiz in high school. I had told my teacher I was sick, but I wasn't. It was a stupid thing to do, a fleeting act of rebellion I'd buried long ago. I gripped the edge of my desk, my palms clammy. The voice wasn't recounting random events. It was pulling memories from the depths of my mind. Memories no one could possibly know. The empty library. You were scared, weren't you? The air in my room felt thinner, and my heart thudded painfully in my chest. It was no longer just a voice on the radio. It was an invader in my thoughts. And then, like a needle scratching across a record, the voice shifted. Evan, it wasn't a question. It wasn't a statement. It was my name. Clear. Personal. Evan, I felt as though the floor beneath me had vanished. My mouth went dry, and I stumbled backward, nearly knocking over my chair. The voice was calm, almost conversational, but hearing my name spoken aloud in that unnatural tone chilled me to my core. I slammed my hand down on the radio, twisting the dial to static and then silence. But the quiet wasn't comforting. My room felt oppressively still, and yet I couldn't shake the sensation that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the building, every groan of the wind outside sent my pulse racing. I ripped the plug from the wall, tossing the radio back under my bed. It was over, I told myself. Done. I wouldn't listen again, except it wasn't done. That night, as I lay staring at the ceiling, I swore I heard it. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. Evan, the word didn't come from the radio this time. It came from somewhere closer, somewhere I couldn't pinpoint. I sat bolt upright, scanning the room, but there was nothing. Only shadows cast by the dim light from the street. Paranoia wrapped around me like a second skin, refusing to let go. My mind raced. How did it know my name? My memories? How could a signal, a voice, be so intimate, so invasive? The next day, the sound followed me, faint and intermittent. In the shuffle of papers in class, in the low hum of the air conditioning, I thought I heard it. At first, I told myself I was imagining it. But no matter where I went, the whisper, if it even was a whisper, seemed to trail just behind me, haunting the edges of my reality. This wasn't just a signal anymore. It was something else entirely, something I couldn't escape. I needed answers. Whatever was happening, it was beyond a stray signal or a malfunctioning radio. It was personal. The voice on the airwaves had pried open a vault of memories only I had the key to, and now it felt like I was the one being tuned into. That morning, I skipped class, locking myself in my tiny apartment with my laptop and a determination to unravel this mystery. If anyone had heard this frequency before, surely the internet would have breadcrumbs, something to guide me. I started with the basics, searching for radio anomalies and unexplained broadcasts. The results were a mix of conspiracy theories and technical jargon, none of which felt concrete. But then I stumbled across an obscure message board buried deep in the search results. Its name almost unremarkable: the Signal Files. The discussions there were surreal, threads of users recounting experiences that felt eerily familiar to mine. A man in Ohio spoke of a voice on his old transistor radio that told him where he'd hidden his grandmother's wedding ring as a child. A woman in Glasgow claimed the signal predicted her father's stroke, down to the exact minute. And then there was a post that stopped me cold. The thread's title read, "What happens when it calls your name?" The user described hearing a voice through their radio, recounting personal memories, and eventually calling their name. They wrote that after the voice addressed them directly, strange occurrences began. Objects moved around their home, doors left open they swore they'd closed. They felt watched, followed. And then the post stopped abruptly. No replies, no updates, just silence. Chills ran down my spine as I read through similar accounts. Each had the same pattern. The voice knew too much, became too familiar, and the listeners disappeared into the ether. The accounts were scattered across decades and continents, but they all shared one detail: the frequency. It was always the same 18.7 megahertz. The problem was, 18.7 megahertz wasn't a frequency that should even exist, at least not for regular broadcasts. It fell into the gap between licensed bands, a dead zone for traditional stations. My limited knowledge of radio technology couldn't explain it, but one thing was clear. This wasn't a typical signal. As I dug deeper, the details grew murkier. Some posters claimed it was a government experiment gone wrong, a rogue AI trained to sift through the human psyche. Others leaned into the supernatural, suggesting the voice was an entity trying to lure listeners into its grasp. But there were no concrete answers, only theories spiraling out of control. I found one name repeated across threads, Dawson's Patch. It was referenced like a location, but no one seemed to agree on what it was. Some claimed it was a ghost town in Pennsylvania. Others said it was a digital code embedded in the signal itself. A few insisted it was a metaphor for some other plane of existence. What disturbed me most was how these accounts all ended the same way. No one who interacted with the voice for long ever stayed active in the forums. Their profiles became ghost towns, their discussions frozen in time. The weight of it pressed down on me as I sat back in my chair. Every trail I followed led to nothing. Abandoned threads, deleted accounts, unanswered questions. That night, I couldn't bring myself to turn on the radio, but I couldn't ignore it either. The static was still there, lingering in the edges of my awareness, like tinnitus after a loud concert. And then, a thought struck me. If the voice could call me by name and recount my past, then maybe it wasn't just broadcasting. Maybe it was listening, too. I unplugged the radio completely and shoved it into my closet, burying it under a pile of old textbooks. It was irrational, I knew, but I had to put some distance between me and that thing. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Not by a person or a camera, but by something far more invasive, something that didn't need eyes or technology to know where I was or what I was thinking. What was I dealing with? A rogue signal? A ghost in the machine? Or was it something worse? Something that had no name? The name surfaced during my endless dive into the message boards. Elliot Grayson. It appeared in a thread about unusual signals. A passing mention by a user who claimed they'd known someone who went too deep while chasing the same frequency. My heart skipped a beat when I realized the connection. Elliot had lived in my city. He'd vanished 5 years ago, his disappearance a mystery no one could explain. I remembered the story vaguely from local news. He was a young man, barely older than me, with a reputation for being reclusive and obsessive. When he disappeared, there had been no signs of foul play, no leads, no goodbyes. Just silence. If there was anyone who might have answers, even secondhand, it would be him. By noon, I'd found his last known address. It was a crumbling duplex on the edge of town, the kind of place that felt like it had been forgotten by time. I stood outside for a while, debating whether I should even knock, but the windows were boarded up, and the mailbox was overflowing with flyers and letters from years ago. The door wasn't locked. I stepped inside, immediately hit by the smell of dust and decay. The air was heavy, thick with the absence of life. The living room was cluttered with relics of a man who disappeared. Old newspapers, a toppled lamp, a coat still draped over the back of a chair. It was like the house had frozen in time the moment he vanished. But it was the back room that stopped me in my tracks. It looked like a laboratory of obsession. Radios of all shapes and sizes lined the walls, their knobs rusted with disuse. Antennas jutted out at awkward angles, some tangled in wires that hung like cobwebs. A desk sat in the center, covered in notebooks, coffee-stained maps, and a tangle of cables leading to a makeshift transmitter. And then there was the diary. It sat open on the desk, its pages yellowed and brittle, scrawled with a frantic, looping handwriting. My hands trembled as I picked it up, flipping to the first page. The voice started as a curiosity. Now it feels like a curse. I hear it even when the radio is off. The entries that followed detailed his descent into madness. Elliot had found the frequency while experimenting with a homemade receiver. At first, it was static, then a faint voice. He'd spent weeks trying to make sense of it, tuning and retuning, convinced it was a pirate station or a government broadcast. But then the voice began speaking directly to him. "It knows things," he wrote, "things no one else could. My childhood dreams, my worst mistakes, secrets I've never told anyone. It's like it's inside my head." As the entries progressed, they became more erratic, the handwriting jagged and frantic. He described sleepless nights, objects in his home moving on their own, shadows that flickered in his peripheral vision. "It called my name last night. Not just my name, my full name. I unplugged the radio, but the voice didn't stop. It's in the walls. It's in me." The final entry was scribbled so hastily it was barely legible. "Dawson's Patch. It's not a place. It's a door, and I think it's opening." I dropped the diary, my pulse hammering in my ears. The air in the room felt stifling, as if the walls were pressing in. I wanted to run, to leave this cursed place and never look back. But then my eyes landed on the largest radio in the room, a hulking piece of equipment with a glowing red dial. It was on, and it was tuned to 18.7 megahertz. The static crackled, sharp and alive, like the hiss of a serpent. I didn't dare move closer, but the sound seemed to reach for me, wrapping around my thoughts like a noose. And then I heard it, a voice, faint but unmistakable, rising from the chaos of static. "Elliot," it whispered, the syllables stretching unnaturally. "Elliot isn't here anymore." I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. The voice shifted, low and guttural, as if it were clawing its way through the airwaves. "You're next." The radio went silent. I ran. I barely slept after leaving Elliot's house. The diary was seared into my memory, its cryptic warnings echoing in my thoughts. Dawson's Patch wasn't a place, it was a door. But a door to where? When I finally succumbed to exhaustion, my dreams were a mess of shifting shadows and static, a distorted hum pulling me deeper into the unknown. The voice from the radio lingered at the edges, slipping in and out of my consciousness. By the time the sun rose, I knew what I had to do. The radio was waiting for me on my desk when I returned home, its worn dials glinting like the eyes of a predator. I hadn't touched it since that first night, yet somehow it felt alive, as if it had been listening to me all along. I turned the knob with trembling fingers, tuning back to 18.7 megahertz. The static roared to life, louder than ever, and then, almost imperceptibly, it began to part, like curtains pulling back to reveal a stage. At first, it was just faint murmurs, layered and indistinct. But as I listened closer, the voices began to sharpen, separating into distinct tones and cadences. "Help us," one pleaded, the words stretching like they were being dragged through mud. Another was angrier, clipped and venomous. "You shouldn't have come here." The room felt colder, the air heavy with an unnatural charge. I recognized some of the voices, Elliot's unmistakable desperation, a woman sobbing, a child's frightened whimper. But there were others I couldn't place, voices that spoke in fragmented sentences, as if their words had been broken by whatever force bound them here. I flipped through Elliot's diary again, searching for clues. One entry stood out now, one I hadn't fully understood before. They're caught in the static. They can't leave, but they see everything. They know everything. Could it be true? Could the voices on the frequency really belong to the vanished? The thought made my skin crawl, but it also made a horrifying kind of sense. I pressed closer to the radio, my ear practically against the speaker. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. The static hissed in response, and then the voices returned, layered and chaotic, as if dozens of people were speaking at once. "We are the lost." The words chilled me to my core. "Why can't you leave?" I asked, my throat dry. The static flared, angry and sharp, and then a single voice emerged from the chaos, low and threatening. "They took us, and now they want you." A sudden knock at my door made me jump. My heart raced as I turned to look, but the room was empty. The knock came again, louder this time, echoing in perfect rhythm with the static. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. When I turned back to the radio, the static was gone. In its place was a silence so oppressive it felt like the room itself was holding its breath. And then, a new voice spoke, calm and deliberate. "They're coming for you, Alex." I froze. No one knew my name. The radio shut off abruptly, leaving me in a suffocating quiet. But the silence didn't last. From somewhere behind me, a faint hum began to rise, low and mechanical, like the sound of a signal searching for a connection. And then I heard it. The same frequency, faint and persistent, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. I spun around, my eyes darting to every corner of the room, but there was nothing there. The sound grew louder, filling my head, and with it came the voices again, pleading, mocking, accusing. "Help us! Run! It's too late!" The walls seemed to close in, the hum rising to a deafening pitch. I grabbed the radio, desperate to turn it off, but the dials wouldn't budge. And then, the voice returned, louder and more commanding than before. "You've opened the door." The room went dark. The hum stopped abruptly, replaced by a single, echoing phrase that chilled me to the bone. "We'll see you soon."